and welcome to another podcast episode of Relationships with DAP. We are the Community Education Outreach Team for the Domestic Abuse Project of Delaware County, also known as DAP. I am Nicole Powell, the Community Education Manager.
Hi, everyone. My name is Veronica Lynch, and I am the Outreach Awareness Specialist. And today we are joined by our lovely children's counselor. Jude, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jude. My pronouns are they, them, and I am the children's counselor here at DAP. Help out with children's programming as well as support for parents who are looking for support through the DV situations.
Perfect.
Awesome. So we are your hosts today as we learn and talk about the barriers of transgender survivors accessing, domestic violence services. So without further ado, it's
time to get
real.
Everybody's fine.
Now I feel like you guys are setting me up to look dumb because I get started and no one else starts. I felt that it was a clear start. I felt like bullying.
Not bullying, my love. Oh my.
So as it was mentioned, today, yes, we are talking about transgender survivors, their experiences with domestic violence, and what is hindering individuals from accessing domestic violence services. And as Jude mentioned, they are our children's counselor here, but they also have a background and knowledge with transgender survivors. So would you like to expand upon that, Jude?
Sure. I guess just like a little bit about myself. Like I identify as a non-binary lesbian, and so my like lived experiences are, I know a lot of people who are both like non-binary and like binary trans, and so I've spent a lot of time, especially over the past year, kind of like looking into the ways in which DV services specifically, kind of based on their kind of like gendered background, tend to intentionally or unintentionally kind of leave gaps where trans survivors can't access services or the services aren't the most supportive. So that's definitely something I've been looking into a lot, especially kind of like ramping up the past couple of months.
Right.
Perfect.
So to kind of like just jump right in and get into the conversation, and as we mentioned, we've been doing this for the past couple months. So we've been highlighting specific communities. We started with our Indigenous women in domestic violence. Then we had last month, we talked about domestic violence in the South Asian community and experiences that immigrant women face. So what kind of conversations around domestic violence in the transgender community have taken place, if any? What, like on an individual level and also maybe on an academic level?
So this is something that I think more recently there's been really there was like a big kind of gap in research kind of on an academic level in looking into this. So that's something that I've been noticing is that a lot of the good research I found on it really starts around like 2015, and some of it like really just one of them was 2020.
Okay.
And one of the big things that they were noticing and that they're like mentioning in these studies is that a lot of studies would talk about like the general like LGBTQ community, their interactions with DV or IPV. But when they looked into it, there would be such a low percentage or actually no trans survivors included in that. So even though there's a T in LGBT, it was actually specifically reporting on, the interactions with like people with like sexual minority identities, and their experiences with DV, which is just, it is a completely different set of concerns and experiences than the trans community. So that's something that's been kind of like increasing, really trying to take a specific look at transgender people and gender non-conforming people and the ways in which those specific lived experiences are very uniquely tied in with domestic violence.
Right. And I just know from our experiences in the community, when we talk about domestic violence and intimate partner violence, even with like cisgendered and heterosexual identifying students, they tend to downplay it, especially if it's to like female presenting individuals or to male presenting individuals, because right, they already have these strict gender ideas. And so when you apply domestic violence to it, and then you're also applying sexuality to it, it often gets a little like complex. So we're having to navigate those conversations too. So it's good that you bring that up because it often is muddled, and it takes a lot of time to like kind of go through all those layers and break that down.
May I ask a question that may not have been already addressed or supposed to be asked. I think it would be helpful for our audience and our listeners, and even for our staff here at the agency, to get more insight, because I think there have been a lot of questions around what does it mean to be gender nonconforming, which I appreciate because, Jude, we knew you a couple years ago, and I appreciate the knowledge and your experience and just you as a person for opening our eyes and our minds to what this could look like. So can you please explain to our audience about what that means?
Mhm. Yeah, so generally, I mean, gender nonconforming is definitely, I feel like, an umbrella term, and like trans is kind of under that, and then under trans, there's a lot of identities. But generally, like gender nonconforming would be like a person who is presenting or identifying in a way that is different than kind of what society would expect them to be based on their, what people consider their biological sex.
Right.
And now, even when it comes to biological sex, it's a lot more nuanced than like male and female, because there's like people who are intersex. And so there's a lot of different, sexes in general. But generally, like people would talk about being assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth. And, walking through life and like being raised, there's a lot of norms and expectations that come with those roles. So gender nonconforming generally could be something as general as really like physically presenting in a way that is outside of what society expects. But specifically when you move into like thinking about trans identities, that would be having a gender identity that is not aligned specifically with being like a cis woman in a quote unquote female body, or a cis man in a quote unquote male body. So that may look like being like a binary trans person, and like identifying as a like man or a woman, or that may look like being non-binary. And that's not like a third gender, but it's really just like a huge umbrella under which that can look like really anything for anybody. But yeah, it's really just feeling a disconnect from your assigned gender, and kind of finding ways to move through the world that feel more authentic than what is kind of prescribed to you as you grow up.
Thank you.
I think that's a perfect way to kind of put it. Yeah. Did you have anything that you wanted to add or go expand on, Nicole, before?
No.
Moving on. Okay.
I have thoughts that might come up, but I'm gonna let it ride right now.
Okay, cool. So, kind of going back to the question, like, what are the conversations having, like, around domestic violence? Is this something that, you said you, in your own, like, friend group and everything, a lot of non-binary people, and is this conversations that you've had with your friends, or, especially being in the field that you're in, or is this something that kind of doesn't really get brought up?
Well, I think what's interesting is that like I've definitely had friends who have like experienced like, different kinds of like abusive situations, but I definitely don't see them too often like reaching out to DV services. Although it's not really necessarily a discussion that we're having on like an explicit level. I think more generally, there kind of tends to be a disconnect. And this is kind of, I think, both something that is experienced maybe in the trans community as well as kind of in DV communities and in general. This feeling that when trans people experience violence, or when trans people experience discrimination, even if it's within a family or within a partner relationship, that they're like, okay, well, that's transphobic violence, or that's a hate crime, or that's trans discrimination. And then this, on the DV side, this association with domestic violence being especially like cis women, or, a private matter within families that is separate from, trans associated violence. So the idea that like DV services don't have anything to do with transphobic discrimination and vice versa. So, when there's those kinds of that disconnect, it's the feeling of like, oh, well, like trans people should find support through like an LGBTQ agency, or like through their friends and social networks, and like not really identifying those experiences of abuse, and often it can be related to their gender identity, not identifying that as a valid form of domestic violence, and like an understanding that they are, they do qualify for our services, and they can get connected to DV services.
Yeah, and I think that also kind of goes to the conversation that Veronica and I always try to push is that domestic violence is not just intimate partner violence, right? So
Mhm.
that's also amongst like friendships and also within family relationships. And I think a lot of transgender folks experience that within their own families. And of course, with intimate partners too, in terms of hindering their transition or not being supportive of their transition or mocking their transition and their identity, and also threatening to harm that in some which way, shape, or form, whether it be physically and or emotionally, and also sometimes verbally.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of us just don't put a name to it as domestic violence, like, oh, they're just being mean. No, it's unhealthy relationship
Mhm.
behavior that no one deserves to experience, especially if they are transitioning from however they have been quote unquote assigned or identified as, social standards and norms, and really just being forced to do things that they would not feel comfortable doing in a
Mhm.
myriad of ways. And so I think just as a whole in a society, we have to rethink what that looks like and ultimately feels like, even within the LGBT trans queer community as
Mhm.
well, because again, that can be downplayed because again, we focus on lesbians, bisexuals, and queer folk, but transgenders, like they just kind of getting where they fit in, which really they need the most attention,
Right.
in my opinion.
Mhm.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to the point that you brought up with like the research, like quality research beginning in 2015,
Yeah.
Right.
and that kind of lends to the fact that this is clearly an ignored community. And when you look at, homicide rates, especially for transgender women of color, it
Yeah.
doesn't match up. Where you're like, well,
Mhm.
we're seeing these deaths, but then, like you said, the media is reporting it as like hate crimes or um, violence rather than using the specific language of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Because in some of the research that you actually shared with me and that we're sharing like on our social media platforms, it highlights the fact that a majority of abusers are also family members. And we do talk about that. So, could you like expand a little bit upon like the unique experiences of transgender individuals and domestic violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've definitely touched on this that like trans people can experience the same forms of domestic violence as cis people. Like
Mhm.
all of those things still apply. But there are a lot of unique vulnerabilities that happen when you're trans. And so exactly like Nicole mentioned, whether it be like verbal and emotional abuse coming through dead naming and misgendering, and purposefully blocking transition, blocking access to
Mhm.
like trans affirming medical care, um, could be, threatening to out a trans person to, family members, friends, work, places that they're not comfortable being out. Um, there's, and then there is like a heightened like physical violence I know that can happen a lot in intimate partner relationships that can be blamed on, a lot of people will rationalize. I think there's actually there may still be currently, I know that it was states where it was legal to assault a trans
Mhm.
person if you were surprised by the fact that they were trans in a
Yeah.
sexual encounter, and that was something that would hold up in court. And so
Right.
something
Specifically
like
for like
that,
murders.
and yes, no, specifically
Yeah.
for murders, yeah.
Mhm.
Where?
I'm not sure if it's, I think that there may still be states where that's a valid excuse in
Mhm.
court. I'm
Oh,
not off the top of my head, but so
yeah.
it's things like that where it's built into the system that it's acceptable to
Mhm.
be surprised or repulsed by a trans person, and that violence against trans people in those instances is acceptable on the basis of them being trans.
Right.
And so like these are areas where there's these huge vulnerabilities and gaps. And something that is also really important to note is that there's a lot of experiences that can be heightened by the experience of being trans that then also put you at an increased vulnerability for domestic violence and trouble accessing services. For example, like trans people have a higher level of like living in poverty or
Mhm.
engaging in survival sex work or having the experience of being homeless or being
Right.
pushed out by their family. So these kinds of things, those factors in themselves really heighten your vulnerability to domestic violence. And these are all things that are unfortunately higher in the trans community due to, a large, intersection of different, social vulnerabilities. Um, yeah, and I think that when you think about like trans violence, one thing to note is that like when you think about who can be most experience heightened levels of violence, that there is a big vulnerability specifically for people who are visibly trans or are not able to, whether it be pass as their like assigned sex or assigned gender, or have, you know, transitioned quote unquote enough to pass as non-trans in their like binary trans identity. So people who kind of fall in that in between space that are actively perceived as trans are at a heightened, you know, regular increased risk for violence, and also for discrimination in services. So that was something that came up just a lot in research, that even within the trans community, there are certain populations that are much more likely to experience violence, and one of these specifically being trans women and trans feminine people, you know, much more than I think most other members of the trans community.
Yeah, there are three things I want to highlight in this moment. So two of them I want you Jude, to discuss a little bit further, and Veronica, you can too, because you know this information as well. I don't want to put Jude on the spot for everything, but one, we last year we did highlight a little bit more of the Black Lives Matter movement on our social media, and as we mentioned before, trans people of color experience a heightened sense of also like IPV and domestic violence, and so I know a lot of us as in the Black Lives Matter movement have purposely said Black trans lives matter, because they have a whole different experience than us cisgender, right? People of color. And that is what I want either one of you to describe more, because I don't want us to assume that our listeners automatically know what cisgender is. And also, Jude, you mentioned dead naming and misgendering individuals. And I don't want to take for granted that people may know what that means. And I would love to take this opportunity to educate our jobs, educate them on what that all entails, because I know people have questions. We know what they are, but we don't want to take for granted again that we are understanding of those concepts and others are not. So take and pick what y'all want to talk about.
You can kick it off, Jude. I'll just try and bounce in where I can.
Absolutely. So were the things you wanted me to mention? So dead naming, misgendering, and cisgender?
Correct.
Okay. So cisgender would be the term that would be used to describe a non-transgender person. So that would be someone who identifies and kind of moves through the world as what their assigned gender or assigned sex at birth would be. So dead naming and misgendering. So misgendering would be using pronouns or language or names for a trans person that does not align with, you know, how they identify and their correct gender. So for myself, like for example, I'm trans, that would be like I use they them pronouns, so using she her pronouns for me. That would be an example of misgendering me. And then dead naming is kind of a piece of misgendering, and that's specifically using a person's legal name or the name that they may no longer use if they're a trans person who has chosen to use a new name. So not all trans people choose to use a new name, but often they may. So that is, something that people will really sometimes use as a tactic of abuse, would be specifically refusing to use someone's correct pronouns, refusing to use their correct name, and still bringing up that old identity, which can be extremely distressing for trans people.
Right. Yeah. And I think you kind of see that people try and downplay misgendering a bit, especially with it's like, well, I made a mistake, right? And that it's supposed to be an instantly forgiven moment instead of like not really considering the effect that it does have. And we can talk about this a little later too, when we kind of go over like safety planning and things like that. But something that we highlighted in Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month was the effects that these have, especially if with gender dysphoria, and how that can be, leading to risks of suicide and everything. Do you believe that that's a factor that also kind of increases experiencing gender dysphoria increases like risks of domestic violence? Or do you often see, like maybe in research or having worked with, I don't know if you work with any other clients, but that those two playing dually in the relationship or in the family?
So the experience of experiencing gender dysphoria as as it interacts with domestic violence.
Yes. Sorry, that was like a long way to get there, but that's just how it all was in my brain.
That's okay. I mean, I think that the experience of, like I said, like misgendering or dead naming someone and kind of doing things that would increase a person's gender dysphoria, it's important to understand that like that is a serious impact of abuse, just as the impacts on people's self-esteem, or the impact, the physical injury that one might experience in like a physical assault, really like making someone experience gender dysphoria. Like, it's important to understand that while like people have different experiences with it, it's often not just like, oh, I didn't like that. It can be like, incredibly, incredibly distressing. It can lead to like higher feelings of suicidality. So, I mean, it is definitely a big factor, and something that like if a family is just carelessly dead naming and misgendering their transgender family member and causing that person to have extreme dysphoria on a regular basis with intention, I mean, I would consider that domestic abuse.
Yeah,
because you're doing something that is incredibly not only harming, but really exacerbating like a really critical emotional experience for that person, like for the sake of hurting them.
right. And it's obviously like a power and control tactic too. You're making these active choices to misgender a person, and you're seeking some outcome, whether it is to make that person feel bad and kind of keep them where you want them, or perhaps, it's a way to keep them with you. So they feel like, their self-esteem is low. So they feel as if they don't deserve anyone else. These all kind of play into each other. And this kind of brings me to one of the tools that we highlight in the podcast and when we're in the community and working with clients is the power and control wheel. And there is a specific power and control wheel for each community. So if anyone ever has questions and they would like to see these, you can find them on Google, but you can also ask us and we can give it to you.
And it's on our website.
Yes, it is all on our website as well. So if anyone, listening wants to kind of get into more detail about what this could look like, those resources are available too.
Yeah.
So we already talked about transgender women of color are at the highest risk of being killed. So why isn't the language of domestic violence used more often? And you kind of said this before with legally, right? There was the law that said people can, and I do believe it is still in some states, like in fact that that is a defense that you can take in court, is that you didn't know the person's trans, so they tricked you, therefore like they deserve it. So how does that bleed into news reporting and how these numbers are given to the police?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say there. I mean, so first of all, just generally, just transphobia, like we're like, I think still working to move towards a place in society where trans people are viewed as people. Right. And that's a big thing. And so, when you're thinking about like the ways that these things are reported upon, often you'll see these people, they're like transgender people, and kind of the transgender coming before the people part of it. One quote that I saw in research that was interviewing different trans survivors and kind of talking about their perspectives on kind of why trans violence is not more often like called domestic violence, even when it really is that their perspective was calling it domestic violence kind of acknowledges the humanity in trans people, and that they are people that are loved and hurt by people who love them, and that is an experience that trans people can have. And that often on a societal level, we're not ready to see trans people as people and as humanized people who are experiencing the same kinds of, interpersonal and domestic violence that cisgender people are experiencing. So it's easier to say
too, right? So like, even like the intimacy piece is also acknowledging that they too have a right to be intimate with other individuals who genuinely care and love them as people.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, there's a huge othering, and it's not just an othering of like, I think that it's something that trans people experience even more than other people in the LGBT community, of this kind of dehumanization, just like a general dehumanization. And so for those reasons, like it's often just reported as a violent crime or a hate crime, and kind of put into this category of like, oh, it's trans violence. And it is. But when you look at trans violence as this like public large scale issue and totally divorce it from domestic violence, it really takes out a lot of kind of the nuance of that situation. And also I think that there's a piece of it that because often trans survivors don't connect with DV agencies, like they're not getting reported through those systems and they're not really associated with those systems. And there's, I mean, I could go on and on for probably 100 years about the reasons that there's these disconnects between the trans community and DV services.
Right.
But that lack of a link and kind of the way that it gets reported, when it gets reported, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say there. And also just the fact that I want to highlight how much of it goes unreported. And that is so much. I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a huge disconnect between trans people in general, especially trans women of color, with accessing police or courts, and, you know, feeling any kind of safety or inclination to do so, which makes complete sense, because in most instances that is going to be a much more negative and vulnerable and dangerous situation to bring the police or the courts into your situation than it is to just try to handle it on your own. So because, you know, often these things are not going through these formal systems where they get documented and reported. So, I mean, like the statistics are upsettingly high, and the statistics we know are absolutely nowhere near the lived experiences of the trans community.
Right.
Yeah, those intersectionalities and layers pretty much that goes along with trans women of color is a lot. You know, not only are you transgender, you're also a person of color. I mean, for crying out loud, even like Black people in this society are just fighting to not be killed as a hobby. You know what I mean? So let alone being a Black trans person, I cannot imagine. I know what it's like to be an African American woman, but I could not imagine what it's like to be an African American transgender woman. And the complexities that go along with that experience really is underserved and underrated in general, right? And so you may or may not know the answer to this question, and I'm sure it's a question I'm probably jumping forward to, so forgive me, Veronica. But I've been with the agency for 5 years now. Jude, you've been with us for what, 2, 3? 2. I don't recall servicing many transgender clients. How about you? Because I started off as a counseling intern such as yourself, but I don't recall ever.
So there is a lot to say about this, which is when I think about the disconnects between the trans community in general and DV services, I see that the way that I was kind of talking about it with Veronica one time kind of casually is that there's kind of 3 layers, and that trans people feel unwelcomed, unacknowledged, and then unsupported. So what we're kind of talking about is, I think, especially the unacknowledged piece, is that structurally, I mean, I can talk about our experiences in this agency, but I think this is something that is absolutely, I think most DV agencies have similar problems. So for example, we get a hotline call and we are forced to put someone's gender into a system, and we're going based off of voice. If we don't just specifically have a discussion about gender identity in the call, which would very rarely be brought up because it's not part of our protocol, and most trans people are not going to feel safe outing themselves to an agency like this, we're going to put somebody in the system based on what we think their sex is based on their voice. They come in, if we just recently updated our intake forms to include options for trans people to, you know, identify themselves as such. If you have a male and female option, or you don't have a place to put pronouns, not only is there not like a physical mechanism for you to acknowledge your identity, you're not going to feel safe doing that, especially when you acknowledge that you're walking into an agency that is heavily associated with cis heteronormativity. It is, you know, often perceived as a woman's space and a cis woman's space. So just even in terms of safety, whether or not you identify yourself as trans is a huge decision. And one of the statements that really jumped out in someone talking in some of the research, and I jotted it down, is that they talk about trans people being the hidden victims of domestic violence, that they're one of the absolutely least acknowledged and yet disproportionately affected populations with DV, because of the fact that they can, I would absolutely guarantee that we have clients coming through here that are trans and are gender non-conforming, and whether it be by choice or whether it be because we simply don't have the mechanism to recognize that, we miss out on that part of their identity, which, as we know, is a huge part of their experience.
Yeah. And I feel really convicted after you said all that, because I grew up in a household where we were disciplined to say yes ma'am, no ma'am, yes sir, no sir.
Mhm.
And as a hotline advocate, my respectability comes into play, and I'm like, yes ma'am, no ma'am, because usually we hear from female callers, but also we have some male callers too. Shout out to the men speaking out about their experience. And it's hard. And it's not to say that, and you all know me well enough to know that it's not to say that I don't care. It's just I have to again just redo a lot of what I have been taught
Right.
to do, because for me, in my my Southern roots, it's again, we're trying to show respect, and the most important thing we want to encourage our victims is that we hear you, right? And we respect you, because we feel like you're probably not getting that, hence why you're calling us. And so just simply, and even in the education programming that Veronica and I do, even like, for instance, like JARS training, when we have new hires and new interns, I am trying to be more intentional on saying, okay, during our introductions, we do names. I usually do names, department, or like school, right? And now I'm having to rethink and redo, and I do this all the time, but I'm like, wait, pause, rewind, go back. What are your preferred pronouns?
Right.
And I don't think to ask that during a hotline call. I'm trying to get your name, your date of birth, and your zip code, and how can I help you the fastest way so I can answer the rest of these 5 hotline calls that are coming through my phone right now. I don't know. So I have to do better, guys. Help me.
But there were just a couple things that also stood out to me with what you were saying, to Jude, with like the barriers to services. And it's crazy how gendered most of the things in our world are, right? The things that you said were, social services tend to be more like of a female-centered service, right? And that's, like you said, that's historically, that's how it was. Specifically because you think about this stuff coming out of the women's movement, and the women during the women's movement specifically called out and didn't want lesbians involved in the movement. They were like, we don't want that you're taking apart from like our movement for like birth control access and things like that. So then like when we add more and more, especially transgender women of color, right? They're communities that are historically left out on purpose too. And like police, that is historically male centered, right? Masculinity and things like that. So of course I wouldn't want to, even working with these agencies ourselves, and this is our job, it can be intimidating. So if you don't even have like the background that we have and the knowledge we have and experience we have, I'm sure it's like almost like it's too much. I wouldn't want to go through it either. So and my experiences are very different from those who are transgender, especially transgender women of color.
Yeah, it's hard enough as is. As I know for like the Black community, it's hard enough to even to go out and get services. Any community, right? Let's be real. Anybody struggles with reaching out for services. Again, if you add the intersectionalities of like people of color and LGBT trans queer, it's excessively challenging.
Something we got to dismantle, because we talk about gender norms all the time on our podcast. It's like one of our favorite things to talk about. But we just talk about, we're talking about it in a fun way, in the way that we see it in TV and, what we see in the world. But when you think about this, how gender norms are really affecting the quality of life for people, and whether or not, what does this mean if I'm going to make it to the next day, because we don't know what is being thought of in that agency. A majority of people that we see in the community that we work with, other social services, are female, like people who present as female and, use she, her pronouns. So it's kind of like that. So of course, if you're not seeing that representation in the people you're supposed to be going to for help, I'm sure it's discouraging.
Yeah. And I think that one of the big things that I've noticed is that there is a very valid, I think, just absolute breakdown of trust between the trans community and DV services, which makes complete sense. Despite this being a community that should be like, with the level that they're disproportionately affected by domestic violence, absolutely should be something that DV services are thinking about and working to like fully, accept and accommodate and make feel welcome. But that's just not the experience. And so there is this big breakdown of trust that's very valid. And I think that it's something that I'm thinking about in, ways to kind of address that, is that I don't think it's right to try to repair that trust before the work is done on our end to be able to actually support that community. Because we can slap a, flag on the wall, and we can reach out to trans people in the community and say, hey, come to our agency, like, we can help you. And then they're going to call and we're not going to ask for their pronouns. We're not going to ask about their gender identity, and we're going to misgender them and put them in the system. And then they're going to come here and they can put their name on an intake form. But are we ready to, as a full staff and as a full agency, fully treat them with the respect, not dead name them, not misgender them? And there's a lot of work to be done, I think, always individually within people, but especially as an agency, and really addressing the structure and the ways that we, have our processes to make sure that we are really doing the work on our end to be able to earn that trust back of the trans community. Because it makes absolute sense why they don't feel supported by us. I mean, I completely understand that. And that's something that I think that, I'm very serious about, and I'm trying to really devote a lot of time to here, of really identifying and looking at the ways that our agency, our parent agency on the state level, the national level, the way that our systems are, work, how do we change those structures? Because as much as we can, as individuals, do the work to create a welcoming and safe environment for trans people, there's structural work that, isn't really something that like me or you guys can just go fix in the agency. And those are things that need to be addressed and worked on in order to, really ensure safety and quality of care. And it's something that I really think about, that it is so like a hidden victim's invisible situation, because it's like not acceptable. And I think that it's something that I'm working on, is like understanding that there's a pace to these things, and, it takes time to make structural changes like this. But when I look at how far behind we are, just again, I say we, I don't want to say DAP specifically. I mean all TV services and TV agencies like this. As a field, we are so incredibly behind, while also, like I said, often slapping a flag on the wall and saying we serve everybody, but not acknowledging the ways in which we are just unacceptably behind in supporting this community.
I think that's a strong point.
Extremely. Again, the conviction is real. But I will say, shout out to the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, also known as Peace ADV. They are definitely taking steps. There is progress being considered and being made. But of course, on a statewide level, like that's what they're able to do. Locally is a different story. And like you said, Jude, not to call the whole agency, but I'm gonna call it out. We gotta do better, Yeah. And I'll just simply ask this question: where do we start?
I mean, I think that really getting a commitment from the full agency to making the changes and not just making the bare minimum changes is really, really important. That's something that has come up a ton in the research that I've done on DV agencies trying to take steps, is that it's kind of like meeting the bare minimum legal requirement, or the bare minimum, here we'll have like a trans person come in and do a little seminar, a little training, and then that's it. And then they leave and then we're done. And now we're good and we're trans informed. Absolutely not. It takes like a legitimate
Jude, just called everybody out, why don't you? My goodness.
It has to be done. It has to be done. Okay.
It's unfortunately, it's how these agencies work. There's a difference between saying that you'll do something and then actually understanding and thinking about what it means to be failing people who are our clients, and making them actively feel unsafe in our agency, and understanding that that's not an acceptable thing to be like, oh, over the next 10 years we'll work on it.
Yeah.
Maybe at some point we'll repair that trust. Not really, not at all. I mean, this is an incredibly vulnerable community, incredibly under-resourced, feel incredibly unsafe, and we are like just like 100 steps behind being anywhere near where we need to be in terms of creating that place to support them. So really where it starts is a actual like full commitment of not just individuals in the agency, but the agency as a structure in gearing time and effort and resources towards investigating what these, barriers are, and then not just saying like, cool, we investigated them, awesome work. Yeah, actually like following through and taking those steps. And like, even when it comes to things like having to advocate to higher levels, like I've noticed things in our system that I know contribute to this absolute lack of accurate data on like trans experiences with DV, because our options in the systems that report up, they don't include anywhere near the number of gender identities that we need to. And also the fact that it's mandatory reporting to report gender when we don't know. So we're putting in male, female for people that we don't know if that's accurate. We don't know if they're trans. We don't know if they're non-binary. So we're putting people in as cis men and women and reporting that up to a national level for DV statistics. And that is not true. And so when it's something like
and
that,
again,
like,
it's simply based off of their voice.
Yeah.
It's literally on a hotline. It's based off of their voice.
I can deepen my voice if I want to.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, like, it's just like, how do you know? And that's just such an assumption to base, like that it is such a huge assumption to make.
Yeah.
And then I was like,
goes back to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, I tried to bring it up to the agency, and the agency was like, oh, that's a state thing. So they brought it up to the state level, and the state was like, oh, actually, that's a federal thing. Like, we can't change that. So I'm like, who on the federal level is collecting this information on trans people and gender and saying our options are male and female? Report that up to us so we can do statistics. Well, don't do statistics. Like, just don't do the data, because you're actively erasing people's identities. So I'd rather you just not do it. Because it's
that
wrong.
perfectly ties into what we were saying with like research. Why isn't there research there? Because we're doing it wrong.
Because exactly at a very, very base level like this, and then everyone goes, they go, that's so crazy. That's someone at the federal level. I don't know who that is. I guess that's just how it is. Okay, we'll advocate to the federal level.
Yeah,
that whole ideology of like, it's not my problem.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
That's what I was just gonna say. Like, you have to think too. A lot of the times, our numbers are to do funding. So it's also deciding what is important to people enough to put money towards, because we know that we can't do anything without money. You know, that's a majority of what, because we are a free agency, we need a lot of outside funding. So it's, you know, it's kind of, it sucks straight up that what we do also depends on public opinion and whether or not it's going to make people mad, or, you know, what are people willing to donate when they find that when we take a stance on something. You know, I think that, you know, when we look at the statistics, we know they're wrong, and that they don't do anyone any justice. They're not serving anyone anything, because, you know, every website has like the same 4 statistics for LGBT trans queer community. And it's, you know, gay, lesbian, and bisexual. And then they have the statistics of violence against the trans community. But again, now we know that those numbers should be tripled or more than that, because of how we're complicit in that.
Absolutely.
I have a question, and I don't know the answer to this, and I probably feel like I should, but I'm just so used to like inputting things into our system. So, quick question: do we even have is there a category, I guess, I don't know, on that like first form that we fill out into our tracking system, if anyone identifies in the LGBT trans queer? Is that a thing? Do they have that?
So, yes, actually, our options are not male and female. Our options are male, female, and transgender. The third gender, transgender. So if someone is a trans woman, are you going to make me put them in there as transgender, so not a woman, or a woman and not acknowledge that they're transgender? And then there's an option for, do you identify as part of the LGBT community? And the options are like no information, or yes and willing to self-identify. I'm like, just say yes or no, or just say, what is your sexuality? Give options. What is your gender? Give options.
Right.
Not to be a genius, but like, I think that makes sense. Like, and these are exactly the things that I was saying. I brought to my supervisor brought to the agency, brought to the state, said that's a federal thing. Okay, and
give me the contact info. What's their email?
Yeah. No, and I literally sent emails.
This done.
I sent emails and I never got anything back. I'm like, okay, y'all just don't care.
That's so cool. You want to go find the address?
We'll just pull up.
Let's do that later. Honestly. Well, it's the kind of thing and it's because people don't care. And like, it's because, and I think that you can't have these conversations, and we get to this part about like the way the systems fail and like, do we or do we not support? We have to come back around to one of the first things we said, which is like, there are people who work in these systems. Do those people see trans people as human beings?
Absolutely.
Do they care about us? There is trans, like, people are transphobic. People have internalized transphobia, even if they don't mean to. Most of the people, absolutely most of the people statistically working in this field are cis people, and often cis women in the DV field. So like, we have to get, all the way scale it back to the point of like, who's to say that these people, just different people working in different areas of the field aren't transphobic themselves and don't hold those feelings of, oh, trans people don't belong here. These are women's services. We call them, well, but no, there are a lot of services around here that have women in the name. And so I think that there is a level of intention of this is a place for cis women to be comfortable. Yeah. And so, no, we don't want trans people here because trans people are X, Y, and Z, insert, transphobic assumption about trans people and why they don't belong in these spaces.
I'm going to say everybody else, ouch. That was so real. I will say a little, so what I have seen as a trend which is good, but also again, we have a lot more work to do, is they are asking for like how one identifies. Like if you're registering for a training or, you know, submitting a proposal for a symposium or things like that, they are asked, some systems are asking the question, but holistically speaking, we still have a long ways to go.
Yeah, and I think that there's things that we'll do at a professional level in these fields, but when you have a low income, like Black woman of color who engages in survival sex work and is experiencing partner violence, does that change her experience?
Right.
No.
Yeah.
Like, and that's where it's, you know, I have the experience of working in this field as a trans person. And so I have a whole, like, there's like my experiences, like how the field treats people professionally. But at the end of the day, like, that's really less my concern because, like, I'm not in crisis. I'm not interacting with these agencies as a vulnerable person. But when you think about the fact that, you know, it's not just like, oh, it's transphobic and morally wrong that these people are being pushed out of these systems. But I mean, we work in a life or death field, and there is a lot of death, and there is a lot of injury and pain and suffering in this community. That is our community. That, like, we work with domestic violence victims. Those are domestic violence victims, and we are just consistently failing them and kind of saying that is not our problem because they're trans.
I think that's kind of a great point to kind of segue into the last question that I have. I don't know if Nicole, if you have anything else, but or you want to add anything else, but what kind of messages would you like to leave any transgender survivors listening to this, or maybe anyone who has a transgender individual in their family? What would you like to leave people with?
Well, okay, let me see. How do I want to sum this up? I mean, first of all, if you're a transgender person and you are experiencing partner violence and you are experiencing violence in your family, even if it feels like it is because of your gender identity, you are still experiencing domestic violence. You are still entitled to the services and the support in our agencies. Whether or not those agencies are fully ready to support you in the way that you deserve, debatable. Hopefully there are people in those agencies like myself, you know, like Veronica and Nicole, who want to be able to support you and to, you know, reach out. And, you know, I absolutely say reach out, because you know what, like, you are entitled to that support and you are entitled to those services. And if those agencies fail you, I mean, that is their failure, not yours. This is your space as much as it is a cisgender woman survivor. And also, you know, I think one message that I think can be important for trans survivors to hear is it's something that I've seen as part of the reason that trans people can experience so much, especially partner violence, is messaging that trans people get a lot is that they are, you know, undesirable, or that there's something wrong with them, and that they should feel lucky to have anyone in their life be with them. So even if that person's abusive, even if that person treats them badly, that they are lucky that anyone will be with them or anyone will love them. So, you know, if you're a transgender person, if you're a survivor, or if you're a trans person in general, you are lovable. You absolutely deserve the same love and respect and care and safety as anyone else in a relationship. And you do not deserve to accept the bare minimum based on the fact that you are trans. Absolutely not. So, you know, if that is an experience that you are having, or that a trans person that you know is having, know that you are lovable and that you deserve far more than what society tells you that you deserve.
Awesome.
Well said. Yeah.
Thank you, Jude.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I was going to say, you know, just bouncing off that, like Jude said, you deserve services. So if anyone wants to call us and let us know, we always end our podcast letting everyone know what our hotline number is. The number is 610-565-4590. You can call anytime, any day. Even if you're not in crisis and you just want to ask questions, or, you know, you want to find more information about services, you can call that number. You can also follow us on all our social media accounts, which is at DAPDelco. And we have information on literally everything on social media. So, you know, seek that out and see if anything is useful. But again, thank you, Jude, for joining us for this wonderful conversation, much needed, and I think will be very useful for, you know, employees at our agency and at other social service agencies. And I'm excited to see, you know, where this goes.
Yeah. And could I mention
much.
one more thing actually before we wrap up?
Yeah, of course.
This is something that we've been talking about kind of within like the counseling department, but that if you are trans or if you are otherwise LGBTQ identifying and you are looking and you're like a Delaware County resident or locally and you would like to get services from our agency, like I'd mentioned at the beginning of this, I identify as a non-binary lesbian. And I am absolutely more than happy to, prioritize, my availability for trans or otherwise LGBTQ identifying clients, because I know that it can be a big difference to feel like you're, in a space with someone who in some ways, shares those identities and might understand a little bit better. So if you want services and you want to reach out, whether that's through the hotline or walking in, just know that we have a LGBTQ identifying advocate available. And that if you ask for me, I will shift what I can in my schedule to make myself available to you and to, support you in that way.
Perfect.
That's
Thank you.
awesome. Thank you.
And don't forget
To
keep it real.
That wasn't.
Yeah.